Medieval merchants built empires without a single reliable coin. Long before banks or digital transfers, a hidden financial web connected a continent, and its currency was not just gold, but trust itself. By the end of this story, you will see the roots of our entire modern economy in a system of wooden sticks and handshake deals. How could a piece of notched wood function like $1 million contract? And what kept a merchant's promise made in England from breaking in Italy? What does it truly take to build an economy from nothing more than a shared belief in a person's word? This chaotic reality of countless currencies meant that a merchant's strongbox was a heavy, confusing, and dangerous burden. Imagine a trader from Cologne arriving at a market in Champagne, his cart laden with sacks of silver coins. But these were not all the same. He carried English sterlings, Flemish groats, and perhaps even some Venetian ducats, each with a different weight, purity, and local acceptance. The first and most exhausting task was not selling his goods, but finding a trusted money changer to assess his mixed hoard. This specialist would weigh each coin, test its metal with a touchstone, and then calculate its value against the local standard, all while taking a significant fee for the service. The sheer mental energy and financial cost of simply existing in this monetary patchwork was immense, and this was only the beginning of his troubles. The real peril began when he had to transport his newly acquired, and now even more valuable, local currency to his next destination. A lone merchant on a forest road was not just a businessman, he was a treasure chest on two legs, a prime target for every bandit between towns. This constant, tangible threat of robbery made the physical movement of wealth the single greatest bottleneck to expanding trade. The system was straining, groaning under the weight of its own metal. It was within this pressure cooker of risk and inconvenience that the first glimmers of a revolutionary idea began to form. What if the value could travel without the coin? This pressure gave birth to a true marvel of commercial innovation, the Champagne fairs. For a few weeks each year, the quiet fields of northeastern France transformed into the bustling heart of the global economy. Think of them not as a simple marketplace, but as a massive, open-air stock exchange and international clearinghouse, all rolled into one. The schedule was a masterpiece of logistics. One town would host the cloth fair, the next would see the leather and fur traders, and another would be dedicated to the spices and luxury goods that traveled all the way from the Orient. This rotation created a constant, predictable flow of people and capital. A merchant from Florence could sell his silks in Provence, use the proceeds to buy fine Flemish wool in Troyes, and then arrange for its shipment back to Italy, all within a single, secure circuit. But the real genius of the fairs lay in what happened after the goods were sold. The final days of each fair were reserved solely for financial settlement, a period known as the payment days. This was when the real magic happened, when the physical movement of coins became almost unnecessary. How did that work? A German merchant who had sold his timber to a French buyer might now owe money to an Italian for spices he had purchased. Instead of a risky transfer of silver, the fair's officials would simply cancel the two debts against each other. The German's debt to the Italian was settled by the Frenchman's debt to the German. The value moved, but the heavy, vulnerable coins never had to leave their strongboxes. This system of netting debts, of clearing obligations, was the first great leap toward a truly abstract economy. It proved that commerce could run on a ledger of promises, a web of mutual obligations that was far more efficient and secure than any caravan of treasure. The trust that made this possible was not blind faith, it was enforced by the collective power of the merchant community itself. That split piece of wood was more than a receipt, it was a contract you could hold in your hand. The tally stick system transformed a simple debt into a secure and transferable instrument. Imagine a farmer owes his lord 10 shillings in taxes. The royal clerk takes a hazelwood stick and carves a large notch for £1, a smaller one for a shilling, and so on until the entire debt is recorded in a pattern of grooves. He then splits the stick right down the middle through the notches themselves. The farmer takes 1/2 the foil as his proof of payment. The royal treasury keeps the other half, the stock. If a dispute ever arises, the two pieces are brought together. The unique matching grain pattern and the perfectly aligned notches prove their authenticity beyond any doubt. This was a system of record-keeping that was both brilliantly simple and incredibly secure, a perfect solution for a world where few could read or write. But the real financial magic happened when these tallies began to circulate. That same farmer could use his foil to pay a debt to a local merchant, who would then trust its value because he knew it could be verified against the stock held by the crown. The wooden tally had become a form of money, a physical representation of a debt that was both durable and trustworthy. This verifiable promise was the key. It meant that value, in the form of a future obligation, could now travel, be traded, and fuel commerce without a single coin changing hands. Yet, for this web of wooden credit to stretch across a continent, something even more powerful was needed than a perfect grain match. The system required a force that could bind promises made between strangers who might never meet again. This reliance on reputation gave rise to a new kind of power broker, the medieval banker. These were not the bankers of today in marble halls, but often successful merchants themselves who had built a network of trust across Europe. Their most vital asset was their good name. A banker in Genoa, for instance, would have correspondents, trusted partners or family members stationed in key trading hubs like London, Paris, and Constantinople. This network was the nervous system of the new financial web. Now, let us see how this worked in practice. An English wool exporter, needing to pay for silk from a merchant in Venice, would face a daunting and perilous journey for his silver. Instead, he could go to his local banker in London. For a fee, the banker would issue a bill of exchange. This was a simple piece of paper, but it carried immense power. It was an order instructing the banker's correspondent in Venice to pay the silk merchant a specific sum in local currency on a specific future date, often months away. The English merchant would send this bill by courier to Italy. The Venetian silk merchant, seeing the signature of the reputable London banker and knowing his own city's banker would honor it, would accept the bill and release the silk. The actual silver never crossed the Alps. The London banker now owed his Venetian partner money, and the Venetian partner owed the silk merchant. These international debts would then be settled later, often at a major fair, through the same clearing system we saw earlier. The bill of exchange had turned a risky physical transfer into a safe paper transaction, but its influence did not stop there. A bill of exchange could live many lives. That same Venetian merchant, now holding a promise of future payment, might not want to wait for his money. He could take the bill to a local financier and sell it for immediate cash, albeit for a little less than its full value. This practice, called discounting, gave merchants instant liquidity. The financier who bought the bill was betting on the ultimate solvency of the London banker, collecting the full amount later and pocketing the difference as his profit. In this way, a single piece of paper could facilitate multiple transactions, fueling commerce far beyond its original purpose. The entire system, however, was balanced on a razor's edge of trust. A single default, one broken promise from a prominent banker, could send ripples of panic through the entire network. This vulnerability created a powerful, unspoken code of conduct that bound the merchant class together across vast distances. Your word was not just your bond, it was your most valuable commodity. That single, intangible asset was their reputation. A banker's bench was not just a piece of furniture, it was a throne built on trust. When we picture these men, we should not see isolated loan sharks, but the master weavers of the financial web, their networks stretching from London to the Levant. Their power came from information, a constantly updated mental ledger of who paid their debts and who did not. A merchant from Cologne wanting to do business in Genoa would first seek out a local banker. The banker, consulting his network of correspondence or his own deep memory, would vouch for the merchant's credit, effectively lending his own impeccable reputation to the transaction. This was the true function of a letter of credit. It was a passport for money, allowing a traveler to journey across kingdoms, secure in the knowledge that they could present the letter at a partner bank in a distant city and receive local currency. The banker's signature was a universal key that unlocked value anywhere, but their most critical role was in the lifeblood of long-distance trade, the bill of exchange. A banker did not just issue these bills, he actively traded them. A merchant holding a bill for future payment might need cash immediately. He would go to a banker who would buy the bill from him at a discount. The banker was essentially betting that the party who ultimately owed the money was good for it. If his information was correct and his trust well placed, he would profit by collecting the full amount later. If he was wrong, he faced ruin. This is why a banker's reputation was his entire existence. A single default, one moment of doubt about his solvency, could cause a panic. Other bankers would refuse to honor his bills, merchants would demand their deposits back, and the bench would be literally broken, giving us the term bankruptcy. Their entire world operated on a code of honor that transcended local laws, a system where a handshake in Flanders could move gold in Florence. This intricate dance of trust and verification was the engine of medieval commerce, but it required one final, crucial invention to record it all. A merchant's reputation was a form of currency more valuable than gold. In the absence of modern credit scores or international courts, a person's good name was the only real collateral they could offer. A single defaulted payment or a broken contract did not just mean a lost sale. It could destroy a business built over generations, as the news would race through the tightly knit merchant networks. A man known for dishonesty in Champagne would find no partners in Genoa. This created a powerful, invisible force of self-policing across the entire commercial world. Merchant guilds acted as the enforcers of this unwritten code. They would mediate disputes, blacklist members who acted in bad faith, and ensure that a handshake deal made in one country was honored in another. The incentive was perfectly aligned. Building a long-term, trustworthy relationship was far more profitable than any possible short-term swindle. This culture of trust became so ingrained that it formed the bedrock of the first communal financial institutions. In the bustling cities of northern Italy, groups of merchants would pool their resources to fund massive trading expeditions, sharing both the colossal risks and the extraordinary rewards. Their contracts were simple, bound not by elaborate legal language but by the mutual understanding that every man's entire fortune and future credibility were on the line. This was an economy built not on metal but on merit. Your bond was your business, and your business was your legacy. Yet even this powerful web of personal honor had its physical limits. How could a merchant in Cairo trust the promise of a man he had never met from Bruges? The answer lay in a quiet revolution that was already taking shape, not in the market square, but in the cloistered silence of a monastery's writing room. These merchant guilds were the unofficial governments of commerce, the architects of a predictable world within a chaotic one. In any major trading city or at a great fair, their word was law. They were not just clubs for businessmen, they were the essential regulatory bodies that made complex, long-distance trade possible. A guild's first and most vital task was to create a level playing field. They established strict standards for the quality of cloth, the purity of metals, and the exact dimensions of a bushel or a yard. This meant a merchant from Ghent could sell his wool in Venice with the absolute confidence that the measures used would be the same, that a pound was a pound everywhere the guild held sway. Without this universal language of measurement, every transaction would have dissolved into a bitter argument, but their power went far beyond setting rules for weights and measures. The guild's true strength lay in collective action. Imagine a Hanseatic merchant from Lübeck who had his goods seized illegally by a local lord in Bruges. As an individual, he was powerless, a foreigner with no rights in a distant land. But as a member of the powerful Hanseatic League, he had an army of allies. His guild could impose a trade embargo on the entire city of Bruges, refusing all Hanseatic merchants from doing business there until the wrong was righted. The economic pressure this could bring was immense, often forcing local authorities to relent and provide justice. This system of mutual assurance transformed a lone trader into a protected agent of a vast commercial network. It was the guild's seal, its collective reputation, that allowed credit to flow. A banker would be far more willing to issue a bill of exchange to a merchant who came with the official backing of a recognized guild. The guild had vouched for him, and in doing so had staked its own credibility on his honesty. This framework of predictable rules and powerful enforcement began to reshape the physical and social landscape. Guild halls became some of the most impressive buildings in medieval cities, their wealth and influence funding cathedrals, bridges, and public works. The merchants, once itinerant outsiders, were now the pillars of urban society, their organized power laying the groundwork for the modern commercial world we know today. The wealth generated by this intricate web of trust did not simply fill coffers, it built the very skyline of Europe, those bustling hubs of the financial network. Cities like Bruges and Venice transformed from modest settlements into thriving urban powerhouses. Their rise was not fueled by the surrounding farmland, but by their central role in the new economy. They became the permanent, physical anchors for a system built on promises. A merchant needed a secure warehouse to store goods purchased with a bill of exchange, a counting house to manage his complex web of debts and credits, and a fine residence to signal his trustworthiness to potential partners. The city itself became a financial instrument, a safe and regulated space where complex deals could be struck with confidence. This concentration of commercial activity created a powerful magnet for talent. Where merchants and bankers gathered, artisans flocked to supply them with luxury goods, lawyers emerged to draft their contracts, and a whole ecosystem of service providers grew to support the trade. This was a virtuous cycle of growth, each new resident adding to the city's economic energy and attracting still more. The proof of this transformation was etched in stone and timber. Cities competed to build the most magnificent cloth halls and guild halls, their towering spires and ornate facades serving as bold advertisements of their wealth and stability. These buildings were not just beautiful, they were functional. The cloth hall in Ypres, for instance, was a massive marketplace and quality control center, its very presence guaranteeing the standards that made Flemish wool a trusted commodity across the continent. This urban prosperity and the financial systems developing within the walls were two sides of the same coin, each fueling the other's expansion. But a system this complex, built so heavily on interconnected credit, was inherently fragile. The very trust that powered its growth could also become its greatest weakness. A merchant ship was a floating fortune, and the sea was a hungry void. Every voyage was a gamble against storms, pirates, and simple bad luck. The loss of a single cargo could bankrupt a family for generations. This ever-present danger forced merchants to become pioneers of risk management. In the bustling ports of Genoa and Venice, they developed a brilliant financial solution, the Commenda Contract. Think of it as the world's first venture capital fund. A wealthy investor who stayed safely on land would provide the capital to outfit a ship and buy its cargo. A traveling merchant would contribute his skill and his time, braving the perilous journey to sell the goods in a distant market. Upon a successful return, the profits were split, often with the investor taking 3/4 and the merchant the rest. But if the ship sank, the investor bore the entire financial loss. The merchant lost his time and effort, but not his life savings. This simple agreement allowed for massive, high-risk expeditions that would have been unthinkable for a single person to finance. It was a formalized way of spreading the risk, of turning a potential catastrophe into a calculated business expense. For purely maritime risk, the sea loan emerged. Here, a merchant would borrow money to fund his voyage, but the loan was only due if the ship returned safely. If it was lost at sea, the debt was forgiven. The lender charged a much higher rate of interest to compensate for this risk, effectively acting as an insurance premium. These early instruments created a market for safety. They acknowledged that the immense value now flowing across the financial web was worth protecting with financial innovation. On land, the threats were different but just as real. A caravan master transporting silks from Venice to Paris was responsible for every bolt of cloth until it was safely delivered. He faced not only bandits in the mountain passes, but also corrupt local lords who demanded exorbitant tolls. To manage this, transporters would often travel in large, well-guarded convoys, sharing the cost of hired swordsmen. They factored the inevitable losses into their prices, building a hidden insurance cost into the final value of the goods. The very existence of these practices reveals a profound shift. The economy was now sophisticated enough to put a price on peril. The cost of a shipwreck was no longer just a personal tragedy. It was a line item in a ledger, a risk that could be measured, pooled, and managed. This was the final, crucial layer of the financial web, a safety net of calculated trust that allowed commerce to brave the dangers of a vast and unpredictable world. A promise made in Venice needed to be understood in London, and for that, commerce demanded a universal tongue. While the dialects of the market square were many, the serious business of finance was often conducted in Latin. This ancient language became the neutral ground for international contracts and bills of exchange, a common code that allowed a Genoese banker and a Flemish wool merchant to agree on terms with absolute clarity. But an even more powerful language was being invented, one that did not rely on words at all. In the quiet counting houses of Italian cities, a revolution was taking place in the pages of ledgers. This was the birth of double-entry bookkeeping. The system was elegantly simple, yet its impact was profound. For every transaction, 2 entries were made. If a merchant sold a shipment of cloth, he recorded the value of the cloth leaving his warehouse as a credit, and the silver he received for it as a debit. Every exchange was a balanced equation. This created a perfect, self-correcting financial picture. At any moment, a merchant could open his ledger and see not just his cash on hand, but the entire, swirling universe of his obligations and assets. He could track which partners owed him money from the champagne fairs, and which debts he himself needed to settle with his spice supplier in Alexandria. The ledger became the living memory of his business, a map of the intricate financial web he had spun. This clarity brought a new level of accountability to a world built on trust. A dishonest partner could no longer easily obscure a bad debt or hide a failing venture. The numbers told the true story, revealing the health of an enterprise with unflinching honesty. How could a merchant sleep soundly after lending vast sums to partners across the sea? He could open his ledger, see that his credits and debits were in perfect harmony, and know that his commercial world was still in balance. This was the final, crucial layer of the financial system, the written record that gave permanence to promises and made the invisible web of trust something that could be seen, measured, and managed. A devout banker faced a terrible dilemma caught between his faith and his finances. The medieval church strictly forbade usury, the sin of charging interest on a loan. To profit from another's need was to traffic in time, and time belonged only to God. This created a powerful tension at the very heart of commerce. How could an economy grow, how could trade expand, if no one could be compensated for lending their capital? The answer was not to abandon faith, but to innovate around it. The brilliant bill of exchange became the perfect moral loophole. A banker in London would give a merchant local currency. The merchant would travel to, say, Bruges, where the banker's agent would give him a different amount in Flemish groats. The banker's profit was cleverly hidden not as interest, but as a difference in the exchange rate between the two currencies. Since the value of money itself was seen as fluid across borders, this profit was considered a legitimate service, not a sinful gain. Other financiers structured their loans as partnerships, known as Commenda or Commenda Contracts. Here, the investor provided the capital for a trading voyage and shared directly in its profits, but also in its losses. This was not a fixed interest loan, but a joint venture where the financier's reward was tied to the actual success of the enterprise, sharing both the risk and the God-given bounty. The church's rigid prohibition, intended to curb greed, ironically forced merchants to invent more sophisticated and equitable financial instruments. Every transaction required a moral justification. A merchant had to be able to explain his profit not just to his partners, but to his priest. This constant negotiation between the ledger and the soul, between the marketplace and the cathedral, defined the very character of medieval capitalism. It was a system built not just on trust between men, but on a fragile truce with heaven itself. While Italian bankers were mastering the art of the bill of exchange, a different kind of power was rising in the cold northern seas. The Hanseatic League was not a single kingdom but a republic of commerce, a confederation of over 100 merchant guilds and their towns that wove a financial web from London all the way to Novgorod in Russia. Its strength lay not in complex credit instruments, but in sheer collective bulk and control over the essentials of medieval life. Think of the Hansa as a medieval trade superpower without a national flag, its territory defined by shipping lanes and its authority enforced by economic might. They established fortified trading posts called Kontors in strategic cities like Bruges, London, Bergen, and Novgorod. These were not just warehouses, they were sovereign commercial embassies. Inside a Kontor, Hanseatic merchants lived under their own laws, settled their own disputes, and enjoyed privileges negotiated directly with local rulers. A German merchant from Lübeck could arrive in the distant, icy port of Bergen, walk into the Kontor and find a familiar legal system, trusted partners, and a secure bed. This network of safe harbors drastically reduced the risk of long-distance trade, creating a predictable commercial highway across the turbulent north. The League's immense leverage came from its monopoly on bulk commodities. They controlled the flow of timber for shipbuilding, thick furs for warmth, beeswax for the candles that lit every church and castle, and the salt that preserved food for winter. If a local prince threatened a Hanseatic merchant or imposed unfair taxes, the League's response was swift and devastating. They could impose a trade embargo, cutting off an entire city or region from these vital goods. The threat of being isolated from the salt supply, a matter of survival, was often enough to force kings to back down. Their financial systems were simpler than the Italian models, built on trust within their closed network. They used transferable credit notes that could be redeemed at any contour, a system that moved value without moving chests of silver across pirate-infested waters. The rise of the Hanseatic League proved a crucial point. The medieval financial web was not a single, uniform system descending from Italy. It was a patchwork of interconnected networks, each adapting to its own geography and goods. The Italians traded in luxury and credit, the Hansa in bulk and brute force, yet both understood that the true currency of their age was organized, enforceable trust. This legal sanctuary was a merchant's ultimate safe conduct pass. The peace of the fair transformed a crowded field into a sovereign territory for trade, a bubble of enforced order where the usual feudal squabbles and local prejudices were left at the gate. A ruler, whether a count or a king, had a powerful incentive to grant this special status. A successful fair poured vast sums in taxes and fees into their coffers, so ensuring its smooth operation was a top priority. They declared that for the duration of the fair, their own royal peace would reign supreme. What did this mean in practice? Standard local laws, which could be arbitrary and confusing to a foreign merchant, were temporarily suspended. In their place ruled a body of merchant law, the lex mercatoria. This was not a single written code, but a living, breathing set of customs and practices that had evolved from the needs of commerce itself. It was a common law for the marketplace, understood by a trader from Genoa just as well as one from Ghent. The most critical element of this piece was its system of justice. Specially appointed fair judges, often experienced merchants themselves, presided over disputes. They did not get bogged down in the slow, formal procedures of a feudal court. Their justice was swift, practical, and based on commercial common sense. A dispute over the quality of wool or the terms of a bill of exchange could be resolved in hours, not years. This speed was essential. A merchant could not afford to wait months for a verdict when his caravan was packed and ready to move to the next fair. The fair's court also had teeth. Debts contracted within the fairgrounds were given the highest priority for collection. If a merchant failed to pay a debt owed from the fair, the judges could authorize the seizure of his goods, not just at that fair, but potentially at the next one he attended. His reputation and his ability to trade were on the line with every transaction. This created an environment of extraordinary security. A merchant could walk the grounds knowing that the contract he signed that morning would be honored, that his person was safe from arbitrary arrest, and that his valuable goods were protected under the ruler's own guarantee. The fair was more than a market. It was a temporary city-state whose only industry was trust, and whose constitution was the unwavering pursuit of profit. This predictable legal space was the solid ground upon which the entire, dizzying structure of credit and clearinghouse finance could be built. A merchant's word was only as strong as the wax that sealed it. In this age before notarized signatures and digital passwords, trust had to be carved into metal and stamped onto parchment. A personal seal was not merely a decoration. It was a person's legal identity compressed into a single, unique image. Crafted from silver or bronze, often set into a ring, it bore a family crest, a symbol, or a motto. When pressed into warm wax dangling from a contract or a bill of exchange, it created an unbreakable bond. That small, embossed disc of wax was more powerful than a king's decree to the men of commerce. It authenticated a promise, turning a simple piece of parchment into a binding financial instrument. To lose your seal was a catastrophe. It was the equivalent of losing the keys to your entire fortune. as anyone who found it could forge your debts, empty your credits, and destroy your reputation in a single afternoon. This absolute reliance on physical authentication made document security a constant, high-stakes preoccupation. A merchant's strongbox was not just for coins, it was a portable archive of his financial life, filled with sealed contracts, letters of credit, and bills of exchange. The movement of these papers was the true circulatory system of the economy. That bill traveling from a banker in Bruges to a fair in Champagne was not just a message, it was a vessel carrying real, tangible wealth. Its loss or theft could mean financial ruin. To protect this flow of paper gold, merchants employed every tool at their disposal. Trusted, armed couriers were hired for the most sensitive deliveries. Correspondence between business partners was often written in simple codes or ciphers, disguising names and amounts to confuse prying eyes. The security of the document was the security of the value it represented. The entire system's integrity, therefore, hinged on two fragile pillars: the difficulty of forgery and the safety of the roads. A seal was hard to replicate perfectly, and the wax itself might bear a secret mark known only to the issuer. But if a forger had enough skill and the original document in hand, he could work his crime. This ever-present threat made the personal recognition of a seal's impression, or the familiar handwriting of a trusted partner, the first and most vital line of defense. In the end, the most complex financial web in the world was secured by a lump of wax and the hope that a lone rider would reach his destination unharmed. How could such a vulnerable system possibly manage the immense value now flowing across continents? A contract signed in a noisy tavern held as much weight as one drafted in a silent chapel. The real work of finance often happened far from the ledger, in the warm glow of a feast hall or the crowded bustle of a festival. After the payment days concluded at the champagne fairs, the celebration began, and this was not mere relaxation. It was the critical human maintenance of the entire system. Merchants who had just cleared thousands in debt through abstract tallies now needed to look each other in the eye, share wine, and become more than just names on a bill of exchange. They gathered for lavish banquets, toasting to successful ventures and lamenting lost ships, all while carefully building the personal rapport that would guarantee their next transaction. The gossip exchanged over roasted meats was a vital intelligence network. A man might learn that a certain banker in Florence was facing liquidity problems, or that a ship from Alexandria had arrived safely, making its owner an excellent credit risk. This was due diligence conducted with a cup and a handshake. The most powerful alliances were often sealed not with a signature but with a marriage. A merchant from Venice would marry his daughter to the son of a Cologne trading family, formally weaving their two commercial networks into a single, more resilient web. The dowry was not just a payment, it was a mutual investment, a fusion of capital and contacts that created a new transnational enterprise. In this world, your dinner guests were your business partners, and your family tree was your corporate organizational chart. The trust that allowed a piece of paper to move wealth across a continent was not born in the cold logic of arithmetic. It was forged in the fire of shared experience, in the laughter and stories traded over a meal. This invisible social fabric, woven from countless feasts and friendships, was the true collateral behind every loan and the ultimate guarantee for every promise. That web of trust was resilient, but it was not invincible. A single tremor in one corner of the network could shake the entire structure, for this was a world without any safety net. When a harvest failed in southern France, it was not just a local tragedy. Farmers could not pay their local merchants. Those merchants then defaulted on their bills of exchange to Italian bankers, and suddenly, a drought on a small farm threatened the solvency of a financial house in Florence hundreds of miles away. This was systemic risk, the dark twin of the interconnected economy. The most spectacular example was the collapse of the great Florentine banking houses, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, in the 1340s. These were not just banks, they were the pillars of international finance, with clients and debtors spread across Europe. Their downfall began with a series of massive, unpayable loans to a single, powerful client, King Edward III of England. When he refused to repay the funds he had borrowed to finance his wars, the banks were left with cavernous holes in their ledgers. The news of their insolvency spread panic. Merchants and depositors across the continent rushed to withdraw their funds, but the money was simply gone. The failure of these two nodes caused a cascade of bankruptcies, a credit crunch that strangled trade from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. It was a brutal lesson in the dangers of having all your trust in one basket. Then came an even greater, unimaginable shock, the Black Death. The plague did not just kill people, it systematically dismantled the economy. It wiped out both the labor to produce goods and the population that created demand for them. Ports fell silent, fields lay fallow, and the complex chains of production and credit that fed the great fairs simply snapped. For a time, the entire financial web seemed to dissolve back into the local, desperate economies of survival. These crises tested the very concept of trust to its absolute limit. How could you honor a bill of exchange when the man who issued it was dead, and the city he lived in was sealed by quarantine? The system survived, but it was forever scarred and humbled, a stark reminder that an economy built on promises is only as strong as the world that sustains it. A king's ambitions often outstripped his treasury, and this gap created both an opportunity and a trap. Jewish moneylenders and merchants, frequently barred from owning land or joining Christian craft guilds, found their niche in the one sector that was both essential and officially scorned, the business of lending money. Operating outside the strictures of the church, they could provide the credit that kings and nobles desperately needed to fund their wars and building projects, a service the Christian banking houses often could not openly provide without facing accusations of usury. They became the financiers of last resort for the powerful, offering loans secured by future tax revenues or the crown's own jewels. Yet this financial necessity placed them in a deeply precarious position. They were simultaneously protected and exploited by the very rulers who borrowed from them. A monarch would grant a charter allowing a Jewish community to settle and practice moneylending, offering them his protection from popular anger. In return, he taxed them heavily, treating their financial success as a direct source of royal revenue. They were, in effect, the king's personal piggy bank, to be broken open whenever he needed funds. This created a volatile cycle of dependency and resentment. When a loan came due and taxes were raised to repay it, public fury would not be directed at the crown, but at the visible, often isolated Jewish lender. In times of economic crisis, such as a famine or a plague, they became convenient scapegoats. Rumors would spread of financial conspiracy or even poisoning of wells, leading to outbreaks of violence, seizure of their assets, and sometimes their mass expulsion from a kingdom. The very wealth they helped create for the economy became the justification for their persecution. Their story is a stark chapter in the history of medieval finance, revealing a system that relied on their skills while denying them a secure place within it. The trust that powered the economy had its limits, defined by faith and blood. The humble tally stick proved more resilient than any crown. Centuries after the great fairs faded, the English exchequer was still using these notched wooden rods to record the kingdom's finances. Officials would carve the record of a tax payment into a hazelwood stick, split it, and give the foil to the payer as a receipt. The stock remained in the treasury, a physical archive of the nation's debt and credit. This system worked with such elegant simplicity that it endured into the 1800s, Its final chapter, however, was one of spectacular destruction. In 1834, officials decided to clear out the ancient accumulation of tallies stored in the Palace of Westminster. They tossed them into the heating furnaces under the House of Lords. The fire, fed by all that dry, seasoned wood, raged out of control. Flames engulfed the building, and the old Houses of Parliament burned to the ground. The very tools that had built the financial state ultimately contributed to the destruction of its physical heart. Yet from those ashes rose an even more enduring legacy. The double-entry bookkeeping perfected in Italian counting houses did not just survive, it conquered the world. That fundamental principle that for every credit there must be an equal debit created a perfect balance, a self-correcting system of truth. It gave a merchant or a king a clear and undeniable picture of their entire financial reality. This was the true revolution, not in the tools themselves, but in the mindset they enforced, a demand for total transparency. How could you invest in a new trading voyage if you could not see the precise state of your existing ventures? How could a king levy taxes without knowing what was already in his coffers? This medieval innovation provided the necessary accountability for the next great leap forward. The vast, globe-spanning corporations of the colonial era, the complex finances of modern nation-states, none of them would have been possible without this foundational system. It was the framework that allowed strangers to trust in the financial health of an enterprise they would never see. The medieval merchant's ledger, born from a need to track promises across a continent, became the invisible skeleton of our entire economic world. A financial revolution cannot be contained by borders. The sophisticated methods perfected in Italian counting houses soon seeped into the commercial life of the entire continent, traveling not as an army but as a quiet infection of ideas. Italian bankers themselves were the primary carriers, establishing permanent branches in financial hubs like London and Bruges. These were not mere offices, but outposts of a new commercial culture, where the intricate dance of double-entry bookkeeping and the bill of exchange became the local language of business. The Hanseatic merchants of the north, masters of bulk trade, saw the power of these tools and adapted them to their own needs. They began using transferable credit notes that functioned much like bills of exchange, allowing a merchant in Novgorod to settle a debt with a partner in Cologne without a single silver bar ever leaving his strongbox. This was not a matter of one system conquering another, but of a shared logic emerging from the universal demands of commerce. How did a young man in Ghent learn the complex art of calculating exchange rates? He might be apprenticed to a merchant with Italian connections, spending years as a clerk, his head bent over ledgers, absorbing the principles through daily practice. This hands-on training was the University of Commerce. Family networks acted as another powerful conduit for this knowledge. A son sent to manage the family branch in Alexandria would carry with him his father's trusted methods, and he would send back letters filled with new financial insights, weaving a web of shared understanding across generations. The most enduring vehicle for this knowledge transfer, however, was the commercial handbook. These were the medieval equivalent of business textbooks, practical manuals filled with sample contracts, tables of weights and measures, and model forms for every conceivable financial instrument. A merchant could consult his handbook to find the exact wording for a bill of exchange that would be legally sound from Seville to Constantinople. This diffusion of financial knowledge was a form of technology transfer every bit as vital as the invention of the windmill or the printing press. It created a common commercial culture, a shared mental framework that allowed a Dutch trader and a Spanish banker to understand each other with a glance at a ledger. This shared knowledge was the invisible software that made the entire system run, turning a collection of local practices into a truly European economy. All that intricate architecture of credit and trust ultimately rested on a very simple, tangible foundation: wool and wine. The financial web did not spin itself from thin air, it grew from the soil and the backs of sheep. England, with its vast, grassy pastures, produced some of the finest wool in the world. This raw fleece was not particularly valuable on its own island, but across the Channel in Flanders, it was the lifeblood of an industrial revolution. Flemish weavers, masters of their craft, transformed English wool into luxurious, high-quality cloth, a commodity desired in every market from Paris to Constantinople. This single trade route, from English shepherd to Flemish loom to European noble, generated staggering amounts of capital. It was the constant, predictable flow of these wool shipments that created the need for all the financial machinery we have seen. A Flemish cloth merchant needed to pay an English wool grower long before the finished cloth was sold at a fair in Champagne. That time gap, that delay between production and profit, is where credit is born. The bill of exchange was the perfect tool to bridge this distance, allowing value to move with the speed of a courier rather than the slow crawl of a merchant ship. Similarly, the sea loans and Commenda contracts emerged to ensure the risky voyage of the wool across the treacherous North Sea. Every financial instrument was a direct response to the physical challenges of moving a real, bulky product from where it was grown to where it was needed. The same was true for the great wine trade. The vineyards of Gascony in southwestern France produced vast quantities of wine that were avidly consumed in England. Each autumn, a fleet of ships would set sail from English ports, carrying silver and returning laden with barrels of new wine. This regular, seasonal pulse of commerce required immense upfront investment. An English vintner had to finance the purchase of the wine, the barrels, the shipping, and the labor, all months before a single drop was sold in a London tavern. He would turn to a banker, using the future value of the wine itself as his collateral for a loan. The entire cycle, from the grape harvest to the final sale, was lubricated by promises written on paper and secured by trust. The economy was never an abstract game of numbers. It was the smell of damp wool in an English port, the taste of new wine in a Bordeaux cellar, the feel of fine Flemish cloth. The muscle of European production, the farmer, the shepherd, and the weaver, generated the real wealth. The financial web was the nervous system that connected that muscle to the hungry markets of consumption, allowing the entire continent to function as a single, breathing economic organism. A merchant's ledger might list only the names of men, but the hands that balanced the books were often a woman's. While official histories celebrated the great male bankers and traders, the day-to-day engine of commerce frequently ran on the quiet, determined labor of women. When a merchant husband embarked on a 2-year trading voyage to the Levant, he did not leave his business dormant, he left it in the hands of his wife. She became the chief executive of the household enterprise, managing the warehouse, settling accounts with local debtors, and issuing instructions to agents and apprentices. Her signature might not appear on the high-profile bill of exchange, but her management ensured there was wealth to back it. Her financial acumen was not a rare exception, it was a necessary pillar of the entire system. Consider the bustling cloth towns of Flanders. Here, women were not merely temporary stand-ins. They could be full members of craft guilds, overseeing workshops where they trained apprentices and produced the very woolens that fueled European trade. A widow often inherited her husband's business outright, and guild rules frequently protected her right to continue operating it. She could sign contracts, sue for debts, and become a formidable economic force in her own right. These women were not just preserving an inheritance, they were active investors, pooling their capital to fund the risky Commenda ventures we heard about earlier. The ship sailing from Genoa with a cargo of silk might have been financed in part by the savings of a dozen merchants' wives, each betting on its safe return. Their influence extended beyond the city walls. On rural estates, the lady of the manor was often the chief financial officer, managing complex agricultural production, overseeing the sale of surplus grain and wool, and negotiating with traveling merchants. The entire medieval economy, from the great fair to the family farm, depended on this dual effort, a partnership that wove the domestic sphere seamlessly into the web of high finance. These silent partners remind us that trust was not just a bond between men in a marketplace. It was a family enterprise, a legacy built and sustained within the walls of the home as much as in the halls of commerce. A king's army marched on a banker's ledger. The same financial web that moved silk and spice now began to move armies, transforming the very nature of power in Europe. When a monarch needed to pay his soldiers, build a fleet, or fortify a castle, his own treasuries were often empty. The solution lay not in his vaults, but in the credit networks of the great Italian banking families. Kings and princes became the biggest borrowers of their age, and their most urgent need was always war. The English crown, locked in the long struggle of the 100 Years' War, became deeply indebted to Florentine banks like the Bardi and the Peruzzi. These banks funneled immense sums across the continent, effectively monetizing the future tax revenues of England to fund its battles in France. A single victory on the field now depended on a flawless transaction in a counting house hundreds of miles away. This relationship granted financiers a seat at the highest tables, their advice sought by kings, and their influence felt in royal courts. But this privilege came with colossal risk. A banker's entire fortune was now tied to the promise of a single, powerful individual who ruled by divine right and often acted with impunity. The fate of the Bardi and Peruzzi stands as a stark monument to this danger. When King Edward III of England decided he would not repay his massive loans, the two greatest financial houses in Europe collapsed almost overnight. The royal default was a financial earthquake that shattered credit from London to Naples, proving that even the most trusted web could snap under the weight of a crown. In the aftermath of such disasters, kings realized they needed a more reliable way to secure their loans. The constant demand for cash to service their debts to merchant bankers forced them to become more efficient states. They began to systematize tax collection, creating bureaucracies to reliably gather the customs duties on wool or the taxes on hearths that would guarantee their next line of credit. The ability to borrow vast sums now separated the great powers from the minor principalities. A kingdom with access to international credit could field a professional army for years, while its cash-poor rival might struggle to muster a force for a single season. The financial web, once spun to carry wool and wine, now bore the crushing weight of empires and the destinies of nations, binding the fate of the marketplace to the ambitions of the throne. The strength of a handshake could only stretch so far across a continent. While a merchant's personal honor remained his most vital asset, the sheer scale of commerce demanded a new kind of trust, one that was less about the man and more about the mechanism. This evolution began subtly as the dense web of family partnerships that characterized early trade started to strain under its own success. A father could vouch for his son and a cousin for his cousin, but how could a merchant in Cairo possibly know the character of every single agent in a sprawling network spanning a dozen cities? The risk was simply too great. The solution was to build trust into the systems themselves, making the rules of the game more reliable than any single player. The Fairs piece, for instance, was a powerful early example. A merchant did not need to personally trust the Count of Champagne. He only needed to trust that the Count's guarantee of safety and impartial justice would be enforced. This was a monumental shift. The trust was now in the office, the institution, the predictable application of a rule, rather than in a fleeting personal relationship. This same principle crystallized in the Bill of Exchange. At first, its power came from the recognizable signature of a known banker, but over time, the bill itself became the trusted object. Its standardized format, its specific legal language, its clear terms of payment, these features made it a reliable instrument even if the issuer was only a name on a page. The reputation of the Medici banking house as an entity eventually carried more weight than the personal reputation of any single Medici manager. A merchant would accept a bill from a Florentine branch he had never visited because he trusted the system the Medici name represented, a system of accurate ledgers, prompt payments, and networked correspondence. This was the birth of brand loyalty in finance, a leap of faith from a person to an organization. This slow, centuries-long transition from personal bonds to institutional credit was the silent revolution that made our modern economy possible. We no longer need to know the teller at our bank. We only need to trust that the bank itself will honor our deposit. That profound, abstract faith, so fundamental to our world today, was forged in the bustling, noisy crucible of the medieval marketplace. The wooden tally stick and the Bill of Exchange are not relics of a forgotten past. They are the original blueprints for the financial world we inhabit today. That Bill of Exchange, a simple paper order to pay a distant partner, did not vanish. It evolved, its core principle of moving value without moving physical cash becoming the modern check you write and the instantaneous wire transfer that powers global business. The entire concept of moving abstract value is a medieval invention we now take for granted. Consider the shared risk of a Commenda contract, where one partner provided capital and another provided labor. This model of pooled investment and distributed liability is the direct ancestor of the joint stock company, the very structure that built the railroads and now underpins every publicly traded corporation you can buy shares in today. The medieval financier betting on a ship's safe return was engaging in the same fundamental practice as a modern venture capitalist funding a tech startup. Both are allocating capital to a high-risk, high-reward venture, trusting in a system to manage that peril. And what of that all-important merchant's reputation, his most valuable asset? That personal credit score, tracked through the gossip of the great fairs and the ledgers of banking houses, has been codified into our digital credit rating. Your 3-digit number is the modern equivalent of that merchant's good name, a standardized measure of trust that allows strangers to lend you money for a car or a home. Even the systemic collapses feel hauntingly familiar. The catastrophic failure of the Bardi and Peruzzi banks, triggered by a king's default, is a medieval echo of the 2008 financial crisis, where the overexposure of major institutions to a single type of risky asset nearly brought down the entire global economy. The underlying challenge has never changed. Finance, at its heart, is a continuous effort to solve 3 eternal problems: how to move value across distance, how to manage the inherent risk in that movement, and how to build the trust necessary to make it all possible. The parchment and wax have been replaced by fiber optics and encryption, but the essential human puzzle remains. The sprawling, interconnected web of medieval commerce was the prototype, the first successful test run for the globalized digital economy we navigate every single day. The bustling fairs and wooden tallies are gone, but their legacy is the financial air we breathe today. That intricate web of trust and credit, woven across medieval Europe, was far more than a clever workaround for moving money. It was a profound intellectual leap, a collective decision to believe that a promise had value, that a signature could be as solid as silver, and that a shared set of rules could bind strangers across a continent. This system did not just facilitate trade, it built the very idea of a unified European economy, connecting the shepherd in England to the weaver in Flanders and the spice merchant in Venice in a continuous, humming circuit of exchange. It taught a fractured world how to cooperate on a scale never before imagined, proving that commerce could be a civilizing force. The real currency was never just the coin or the tally, but the human ingenuity that devised a way to make them work. So the next time you tap a credit card or watch a digital payment clear in seconds, pause for a moment. You are not just completing a purchase, you are activating a 600-year-old system, a living inheritance from those medieval innovators who first dared to believe that value could travel on a piece of paper and that a person's word could be the strongest bond of all. If this journey through the origins of our economic world captivated you, there are countless more hidden networks of history to explore.